They called his tactic illegal, dangerous, even suicidal. But on a frozen morning in 1943, one stubborn gunner ignored every rule in the Army manual, and within minutes, 37 German fighters lay burning across Europe, and 300 American bomber crewmen owed their lives to a secret almost no one believed. Before dawn, the hard stands of the 8th Air Force stations across eastern England came alive with the ritual every bomber crew knew by heart. Ground crews rolled carts of .50 caliber ammunition across frozen concrete. Armorers checked gun mounts under dim lamps. Pilots walked the length of their B-17s, running gloved hands across cold aluminum skin that still carried scars from earlier missions. Nothing about this morning looked unusual. It followed the same rhythm as every operation that came before it. But inside the briefing rooms and along the dispersal areas, no one mistook it for routine. Too many crews had failed to return in recent weeks. The memory of Schweinfurt both strikes hung over the airfields like a weight no one could shake. Among the men preparing for takeoff was a young waist gunner assigned to the 305th Bomb Group. He had spent months studying enemy attack patterns, recording angles of approach, and refining a firing method that broke the rules printed in U.S. Army Air Force's manuals. Officers dismissed it as reckless. Some called it outright illegal, a technique that violated the step-by-step doctrine used to train every American gunner since 1942. Formal gunnery instructors insisted that proper tracking and deflection were the only acceptable methods, but the gunner had already seen those same methods fail again and again against German head-on attacks around him. Crews pulled on heated suits, oxygen masks, and flak jackets still carrying fragments from earlier raids. Conversations stayed sharp and short. The 8th Air Force had suffered catastrophic losses during the second Schweinfurt raid. On the 14th of October 1943, 60 bombers gone in a single afternoon. Hundreds of airmen killed or captured. Entire squadrons had been gutted. In the weeks that followed, Luftwaffe fighters continued adapting their head-on assaults, leaving many gunners feeling powerless. Morale across bomber groups was deteriorating faster than commanders wanted to admit. The young gunner stood near the edge of the hard stand as crews he had trained filed toward their aircraft. Some of the men had joined only weeks earlier, replacing veterans lost over Regensburg, Bremen, or Schweinfurt. He watched them climb aboard the fortresses, adjusting parachute harnesses and checking ammunition belts as they disappeared into the fuselages. He had shown them every detail of the head-on attack pattern, how Bf-109s and FW-190s formed up above cloud level, how they timed their dives, how quickly the engagement closed. He knew how small the defensive window truly was, and he knew what the official doctrine demanded from his trainees. Track the fighter, calculate the angle, lead the target, fire. The procedure had not changed, even as evidence mounted that it no longer matched the reality of 1943 combat. He had tried to persuade instructors and officers that the manual's method could not work at a closing speed of nearly 600 miles per hour. He had noted that the human reaction time required for tracking was far slower than the 3-second window allowed in a head-on pass. He had demonstrated that firing directly into a predetermined convergence point without tracking might be the only way to disrupt or destroy a diving fighter. But the idea contradicted everything the Air Force taught. It ignored formal range tables, training diagrams, and doctrinal principles developed before the Luftwaffe adopted head-on tactics. To higher command, it sounded like improvisation, not precision. To him, it was the only method that showed results. Engines began to start across the airfield, sending vibrations through the frost-covered ground. Crew chiefs stepped back, giving thumbs up as propellers spun into motion. The gunner remained in place, watching pilots he had briefed only hours earlier begin taxiing toward the runway. He understood the statistics too well. On missions deep into Germany, nearly 1 in 5 bombers could fail to return. Many of the men waving from the cockpit windows were unlikely to see another sunrise. The tension between doctrine and survival had reached its breaking point. Every returning crew spoke of the same problem. By the time they could aim using approved procedures, the German fighters were already past them. The manual insisted they track. The skies over Schweinfurt proved tracking was impossible. As the first bombers lifted into the pale morning light, a question pressed harder than the cold. What if the only tactic capable of saving these men was the one officially forbidden, a method no manual endorsed, no officer approved, and no classroom dared to teach? By late 1943, the Luftwaffe had perfected a method of attack that exploited every weakness in American defensive doctrine. Instead of approaching from the tail where B-17s bristled with overlapping fields of fire, German fighters began forming up at high altitude, directly ahead of the bomber stream. From this position, they dove straight toward the formation, usually emerging from the sun, giving the American gunners only seconds to react. The tactic turned the nose of the bomber into the most dangerous place in the sky. A B-17 typically cruised at roughly 180 miles per hour. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf 190 diving from above could reach 400 miles per hour or more. Together, their speeds produced a closing rate of nearly 600 miles per hour, more than 850 feet per second. At that velocity, what looked like a distant dot became a full attack profile almost instantly. For the men in the top turret or the nose, the moment a fighter entered firing range marked the start of a window barely 3 seconds long. 3 seconds to identify the aircraft, determine the angle, swing the guns, calculate deflection, and fire accurately. In training manuals printed in the United States, diagrams showed gentle angles of approach, predictable speeds, and enough time for a gunner to estimate where to place his rounds. But those diagrams belong to an earlier era of air combat. In actual engagements over Germany, the physics were entirely different. The German fighters were not giving targets to track. They were delivering a high-speed collision course. Even the most experienced gunners struggled to keep up with the rapid changes in angle. Tracer rounds fired from the bomber streamed harmlessly behind the attackers, glowing arcs that testified not to inaccuracy, but to the impossibility of matching the fighters' speed. Inside the bombers, the sensory overload was immediate. The shriek of the interphone, the vibration of engines under maximum power, the sudden flash of sunlight reflecting off enemy canopies, and then the roar of .50 caliber guns opening fire. Gunners shouted ranges and directions, fighters 12 o'clock high, while trying to hold their positions against the violent defang of the aircraft. Radio calls crackled through the formation as crews reported damage or called for assistance. In the midst of this chaos, head-on passes knocked out pilots, shattered windscreens, and tore open the forward fuselage. Many aircraft never recovered from the first strike. The young waist gunner who had been ridiculed for breaking doctrine observed the pattern with growing clarity. Mission after mission, the same thing happened. Gunners followed their training, attempting to track the approaching fighters and lead their shots. But the engagement was over before their calculations could take effect. Even perfect aim could not overcome the delay between firing a .50 caliber round and the moment it reached its target. In the fraction of a second it took the bullet to travel forward, the attacking fighter had already moved hundreds of feet. The round missed not by inches, but by the length of a football field. This was not a failure of courage or discipline. It was physics. No human could track a target closing at that rate. No turret could swing fast enough to keep pace. The doctrine expected the impossible. During one mission, as the interphone erupted with overlapping calls and the bomber jolted from near misses, the gunner experienced the realization that would define his role in the air war. Watching tracers stream into empty space for the 100th time, he understood that the problem was not skill or reaction time, only the method itself. Tracking could never succeed in a head-on attack. The angles changed too quickly. The approach was too fast. The manual's instructions were working against the men who followed them. What he proposed instead was not rebellion, but adaptation. He believed that instead of chasing the fighter's movement, a gunner could fire into a fixed point of convergence location the fighter was guaranteed to cross. It contradicted every page of official guidance, but it matched what the air war had become, a contest of timing, not pursuit. He began quietly sharing the idea with those willing to listen. In the din of combat, with losses mounting and morale collapsing, the so-called illegal technique no longer sounded reckless, it sounded like survival. And as the missions grew deadlier, it became clear that this outlaw idea, dismissed by instructors and ignored by officers, was on the verge of challenging the very doctrine of American air gunnery. Within weeks, it would reshape the battle for the skies over Europe. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe had perfected a method of attack that exploited every weakness in American defensive doctrine. Instead of approaching from the tail where B-17s bristled with overlapping fields of fire, German fighters began forming up at high altitude, directly ahead of the bomber stream. From this position, they dove straight toward the formation, usually emerging from the sun, giving the American gunners only seconds to react. The tactic turned the nose of the bomber into the most dangerous place in the sky. AB-17 typically cruised at roughly 180 miles per hour. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf 190 diving from above could reach for 100 miles per hour or more. Together, their speeds produced a closing rate of nearly 600 miles per hour, more than 850 feet per second. At that velocity, what looked like a distant dot became a full attack profile almost instantly. For the men in the top turret or the nose, the moment a fighter entered firing range marked the start of a window barely 3 seconds long. 3 seconds to identify the aircraft, determine the angle, swing the guns, calculate deflection, and fire accurately. In training manuals printed in the United States, diagrams showed gentle angles of approach, predictable speeds, and enough time for a gunner to estimate where to place his rounds. But those diagrams belong to an earlier era of air combat. In actual engagements over Germany, the physics were entirely different. The German fighters were not giving targets to track. They were delivering a high-speed collision course. Even the most experienced gunners struggled to keep up with the rapid changes in angle. Tracer rounds fired from the bomber streamed harmlessly behind the attackers, glowing arcs that testified not to inaccuracy, but to the impossibility of matching the fighters' speed. Inside the bombers, the sensory overload was immediate. The shriek of the interphone, the vibration of engines under maximum power, the sudden flash of sunlight reflecting off enemy canopies, and then the roar of .50 caliber guns opening fire. Gunners shouted ranges and directions, fighters 12 o'clock high, while trying to hold their positions against the violent buffeting of the aircraft. Radio calls crackled through the formation as crews reported damage or called for assistance. In the midst of this chaos, head-on passes knocked out pilots, shattered windscreens, and tore open the forward fuselage. Many aircraft never recovered from the first strike. The young waist gunner who had been ridiculed for breaking doctrine observed the pattern with growing clarity. Mission after mission, the same thing happened. Gunners followed their training, attempting to track the approaching fighters and lead their shots. But the engagement was over before their calculations could take effect. Even perfect aim could not overcome the delay between firing a .50 caliber round and the moment it reached its target. In the fraction of a second it took the bullet to travel forward, the attacking fighter had already moved hundreds of feet. The round missed not by inches, but by the length of a football field. This was not a failure of courage or discipline. It was physics. No human could track a target closing at that rate. No turret could swing fast enough to keep pace. The doctrine expected the impossible. During one mission, as the interphone erupted with overlapping calls and the bomber jolted from near misses, the gunner experienced the realization that would define his role in the air war. Watching tracers stream into empty space for the 100th time, he understood that the problem was not skill or reaction time, only the method itself. Tracking could never succeed in a head-on attack. The angles changed too quickly. The approach was too fast. The manual's instructions were working against the men who followed them. What he proposed instead was not rebellion, but adaptation. He believed that instead of chasing the fighter's movement, a gunner could fire into a fixed point, a convergence location the fighter was guaranteed to cross. It contradicted every page of official guidance, but it matched what the air war had become, a contest of timing, not pursuit. He began quietly sharing the idea with those willing to listen. In the din of combat, with losses mounting and morale collapsing, the so-called illegal technique no longer sounded reckless. It sounded like survival. And as the missions grew deadlier, it became clear that this outlaw idea, dismissed by instructors and ignored by officers, was on the verge of challenging the very doctrine of American air gunnery. Within weeks, it would reshape the battle for the skies over Europe. You said. Chapter 3. The birth of a forbidden tactic approximately equals 700 words. Flashback to protagonist's childhood, hunting, farm life, or a personal moment that explains how he understood moving targets differently. Show how he developed the idea, shooting at a fixed point, not tracking the target. Explore emotional conflict. He knows this idea works, but teaching it violates Army doctrine. Introduce supporting characters, doubters, believers, and those traumatized by recent losses. Build slow suspense. Will anyone trust a gunner over official manuals written by generals? And the chapter with the secret nighttime meeting, where he decides to test his concept anyway. The airfield chosen for the experiment sat several miles from the main base. isolated enough that few would notice what the men intended to do. Frost covered the grass, and a sharp wind cut across the open ground cold enough to sting exposed skin and rattle the metal frames of the practice targets. In the distance, a maintenance crew warmed up a training aircraft, the rumble of the radial engine echoing against the low clouds. The gunnery range usually hosted controlled drills, towing, sleeves, predictable patterns, nothing resembling the chaos of real combat. But on this morning, it would become the proving ground for a tactic no manual recognized. The small group of volunteers arrived quietly, carrying only their gear and the uneasy mixture of fear and curiosity that had grown since the sergeant first proposed his idea. Most had flown through missions that ended in catastrophic losses. They remembered the violent jolt of head-on strikes, the momentary flash of German fighters diving at impossible speed, and the numbing reality of watching friends vanish in smoke. The thought of testing something unapproved, a method rejected by instructors, felt as dangerous as the missions themselves. Waiting for them was the man who would simulate the head-on attack, a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot from a neighboring fighter group. He had a reputation for precision and a willingness to take risks. But when the sergeant explained the plan, his confidence wavered. He listened in silence as the sergeant described the fixed-point method and outlined how the test would unfold. The pilot looked at the volunteers, then at the B-17 turret mounted on a flatbed stand for training purposes, and laughed under his breath. He agreed to participate, but only with the condition that the rounds used against him were chalk-tipped training ammunition. He made no effort to hide his skepticism. A head-on dive offered almost no margin for error. He understood the speed involved, the steep angle, and the limited escape window. The idea that a stationary line of fire could hit a fighter moving at such velocity contradicted everything fighter pilots believed about bomber gunnery. Still, he climbed into the P-47, muttering that he hoped the sergeant's men were exactly as good as he claimed. As the Thunderbolt taxied to position, the volunteers settled into their places. The sergeant climbed into the top turret of the training stand, joining the gunner chosen for the first test, a man who had flown missions over Bremen and Schweinfurt and understood the stakes without needing explanation. He locked the turret at the predetermined fixed angle, marked by a simple reference point beyond the tree line. He did not track the aircraft. He did not adjust. The guns aimed directly into empty air. Every part of the sergeant's mind knew what failure meant. Conducting an unauthorized test using live aircraft violated regulations. If the experiment proved reckless or dangerous, a court-martial was almost guaranteed. Worse, if the idea proved worthless, crews would continue flying into the same deadly pattern that had claimed so many. He considered how many gunners had already died following official doctrine. He thought of the recent radio calls, the frantic reports from formations being torn apart, and the grim silence that followed each mission's return count. If this test failed, nothing would change. The radio crackled. The fighter pilot announced he was starting his run. The P-47 lifted into the gray morning sky, climbed to altitude, and circled into position. The deep growl of its engine grew louder as it lined up for the dive. The volunteers watched as the aircraft tilted forward, nose down, slipping into the familiar silhouette of a German-style attack. The speed increased quickly, wind screaming across the fuselage. From the turret, the approaching fighter appeared first as a distant point, then a shape, then a threat closing faster than instinct could process. "Hold it," the sergeant said quietly. The gunner did not move. The turret remained fixed. When the fighter reached the calculated point in its dive, the sergeant gave the command. The gunner squeezed the triggers, sending a high-volume burst of chalk rounds directly into the empty sky ahead of them. The tracer glow streaked upward in a tight column. A split second later, the P-47 cut through the stream. White impact marks burst across the aircraft's cowling, canopy frame, and wing root clear. Undeniable hits. The fighter pulled out of the dive sharply, climbing away and leveling off before circling back toward the range. The volunteers stared upward, stunned into silence. When the Thunderbolt landed, the pilot climbed out slowly, wiping chalk residue from the nose. He walked toward the group, no longer amused. He admitted that if those had been live rounds, he would not have survived the pass. The sergeant's method dismissed, criticized, and officially forbidden had done what tracking fire could not. It had placed a wall of bullets directly in the path of an attacking fighter. One of the volunteers exhaled shakily, still staring at the chalk marks. Another traced a line along the turret barrel as if seeing it for the first time. The sergeant looked across the range. understanding exactly what they had just proven. If this works in combat, one gunner murmured, breaking the silence, everything changes. Word of the test did not remain contained to the remote gunnery range for long. By afternoon, men in neighboring barracks were whispering about what they had heard. A P-47 hit repeatedly, in a head-on dive, struck not by tracking fire, but by a fixed line of bullets placed in the sky. The kid has a trick, someone muttered in a mess hall. Says he can stop a German without even following him. Across airfields in East Anglia, the rumor spread faster than any official briefing. Crews who had endured months of losses listened with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Anything that challenged the grim pattern of recent missions became a spark of hope. Within days, small circles of gunners began gathering after flights, not to revisit their failures, but to study hastily drawn sketches. Chalk diagrams scrawled onto hangar floors showed the geometry of the head-on attack. Napkins in the mess hall carried penciled convergence points. Men used empty shell casings as markers to illustrate how a fighter would intersect a fixed trajectory. The sergeant and his small group of early believers moved from barracks to dispersal areas, training any gunner willing to listen. Their sessions were informal, improvised, and always quiet. Nothing in the manual supported what they taught. Everything in the skies demanded it. For many of the younger gunners, the idea represented more than a tactic. It restored a sense of agency. They had watched friends disappear in fireballs. They had returned from missions searching for familiar bombers that never reappeared in the landing pattern. The standard method had failed them repeatedly. Now, in the crude diagrams and the calm explanations of the sergeant, they found something rare in late 1943, a reason to believe things could change. But not everyone welcomed the shift. Officers responsible for maintaining discipline and adherence to doctrine noticed the gatherings. Some warned the men to stop wasting time on unofficial nonsense. One instructor accused the sergeant of undermining standardized Army training. In briefings, senior non-commissioned officers emphasized once again that tracking fire was the backbone of air gunnery. The sergeant's method, though gaining followers, still carried the weight of disobedience. Resistance grew more intense when a squadron operations officer confronted the sergeant directly, demanding an explanation for his unsanctioned instruction. The officer insisted that deviation from doctrine threatened the integrity of training across the group. To him, the idea of firing at empty air violated not only procedure, but common sense. If the Air Force wanted innovation, he said sharply, it would come from headquarters, not from a waste gunner with chalk on his hands. The confrontation reached its peak when word of the unauthorized training sessions reached a senior commander overseeing several bomb groups. Summoning the sergeant to his office, the commander prepared for disciplinary action. The room was formal, its walls lined with maps of bombing routes over Germany. He expected to hear excuses or apologies. Instead, the sergeant presented the results of the test with calm precision, the fixed point method, the impact marks on the P-47, and the repeated failures of tracking fire during actual combat missions. For a long moment, the commander said nothing. He had personally reviewed the casualty reports from Schweinfurt, seen the names of dozens of crews lost in minutes to the very attacks the sergeant sought to counter. He understood the physics involved, even if the manuals did not account for them. His responsibility was not to the doctrine, but to the men who flew under it. Finally, he stood, walked to the map, and traced a finger along the bomber route planned for an upcoming operation. Without turning around, he issued his decision. There would be one final test, this time not on a quiet range, but in combat. A select group of trained gunners would be assigned to aircraft in the next deep penetration raid. If the method worked, under real conditions, he would bring the results directly to higher command. If it failed, the experiment would end immediately. The sergeant left the office knowing that the decisive moment was no longer theoretical. The next mission would determine whether his idea remained a whispered rumor or reshaped the Air Force's understanding of survival. In the European Air War, the morning of the raid began like so many others, crews gathering in briefing rooms, tracing their fingers along red yarn stretched across maps of northern Germany. The target for the day lay deep in hostile territory, requiring a long, exposed route that guaranteed fighter resistance. Officers reviewed the expected threats, flak belts along the coast, interception zones near Oldenburg, and finally the head-on attacks that had become the Luftwaffe's most lethal tactic. For most groups, the briefing carried an air of inevitability. Losses were expected, survival was uncertain, But within a small subset of bombers scattered through the formation, the atmosphere felt different. The gunners in those aircraft had spent 2 intense weeks training. Under the sergeant's instruction, they had practiced the fixed point principle repeatedly, their muscles conditioned to resist the instinct to track. They would soon see whether the method held under the pressure of real combat. As the formation lifted into the cold November sky, the students took their positions. In the top turret, waist stations, and cheek guns, they ran gloved hands across their .50 caliber mounts, steadying themselves against the vibrations of the engines. Their breaths formed small clouds in the frigid air circulating through the fuselage. For some, the hours leading up to interception were the most difficult time to think, to question, to anticipate. The sergeant's instructions played through their minds. Lock the turret. Hold the point. Do not chase the attacker. Every instinct told them otherwise. But they had committed to the method. Whether it would work now, under the weight of a full Luftwaffe assault, remained uncertain. The first warning came from the forward elements of the formation. A clipped, urgent transmission crackled across the radio net. Bandits. 12 o'clock high, multiple groups. They're forming up. The gunners stiffened. Ahead of the bomber stream, small glints of sunlight flashed as fighters maneuvered into position. Within seconds, the isolated specks became tight clusters of Messerschmitt Bf 109s, accompanied by several Focke-Wulf 190s. They climbed above the formation, silhouetted against the pale sky before tipping forward into their attack dives. In aircraft, not trained under the new method, gunners instinctively attempted to track the first wave. Turrets swung rapidly as the fighters descended, but the angles changed too quickly. The familiar pattern repeated. Tracers streamed uselessly behind the approaching aircraft, but inside the bombers carrying the sergeant students, the guns remained still locked onto predetermined convergence points far ahead of the nose. The first wave committed to the attack, diving at nearly 400 miles per hour. The fighters closed the distance with astonishing speed, their engines howling through the thin air. One gunner later recalled that the approaching aircraft looked less like machines and more like streaks of metal pulled along invisible rails. As they approached the fixed point, the trained gunners opened fire. The effect was immediate. Instead of the scattered arcs of tracking fire, each bomber produced a concentrated wall of .50 caliber rounds. The lead Bf 109 flew directly into it. The aircraft's engine cowling erupted in fragments. Its propeller sheared off, and the fighter disintegrated in a burst of flame. The second fighter, diving slightly below the first, crossed the same convergence zone milliseconds later. Rounds tore through its canopy. It rolled violently and vanished into a cloud layer below. Across the formation, the phenomenon repeated. Fighters entered the kill zone at full speed, encountering dense concentrations of fire placed exactly where the sergeant had calculated they would be. Engines burst apart. Wings snapped under sudden stress. Pilots reacted too late. Their aircraft committed to trajectories that offered no escape. The gunners were no longer trying to anticipate where the Germans would be. They were letting the Germans fly into the bullets. Radio traffic from American crews reflected a mixture of disbelief and awe. He flew right into it. Another one. He didn't even evade. That's 3 from our turret 3. Within minutes, 14 German fighters were down. The next wave hesitated briefly as they witnessed the unnatural effectiveness of the defense. Head-on attacks had once been their most reliable tactic. Now, the formation seemed to possess an almost preternatural accuracy. Still, ordered to press the attack, they rolled into another dive. The result was even more devastating. A Focke-Wulf 190 caught the fire at precisely the wrong instant. Shells ripped through its fuel tank, igniting it mid-dive. Another fighter attempted to adjust its line of approach, only to intersect the stream of rounds that had already been established. 7 more fell in quick succession. By the time the third wave attempted their run, the Luftwaffe pilots were visibly shaken. They spread out, tried irregular approaches, anything to break the pattern, but their momentum-based tactic forced them into predictable paths. In total, 37 German fighters were destroyed in less than 10 minutes. Inside the Luftwaffe's ranks, the psychological shock was severe. Pilots accustomed to exploiting the vulnerability of the B-17's nose could not comprehend how the Americans were suddenly generating such precise lethal fire. What they had once considered a predictable attack had become a gauntlet of invisible barriers, kill zones they could neither see nor avoid. For the bombers carrying the sergeant's trained gunners, the transformation was immediate and undeniable. Not a single one of their aircraft fell. As the formation reassembled after the final attack wave, the crews understood the significance of what had happened. The tactic had not just worked, it had altered the dynamics of the air battle. Hours later, when the bombers returned to their base, crews emerged from the aircraft exhausted, shaken, and overwhelmingly alive. On the hard stand, the sergeant waited, unsure of what the results had been. The lead gunner stepped down from his aircraft, face streaked with credite, eyes still wide with adrenaline. He crossed the tarmac without hesitation. He gripped the sergeant's shoulders, steadying himself as much as expressing gratitude, and said the words that would echo long after the war. "You saved my life today." In the days following the mission, reports flowed upward through the chain of command with an urgency seldom seen in the 8th Air Force. Intelligence officers cross-checked gun camera footage. Squadron leaders compiled witness accounts. Maintenance crews tallied the extraordinary number of confirmed kills, attributed to defensive fire from the bombers that had employed the new method. 37 German aircraft destroyed in a single engagement, without a single loss among the trained group. For commanders who had grown accustomed to writing condolence letters after every deep penetration raid, the numbers bordered on unbelievable. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Meetings were called. Doctrine officers pored over the battle results. Senior commanders debated whether the tactic violated existing regulations or revealed the need for immediate revision, though none openly acknowledged it. Many recognized that the innovation had not come from formal channels, research divisions, or advanced training schools. It had come from a sergeant, one of thousands armed with little more than experience, observation, and the willingness to question established thought. Within 2 weeks, the method quietly entered official procedure under the neutral terminology of fixed-point fire control. Manuals were amended, training films were updated, instructors across England received new guidance. In head-on attacks, gunners would no longer track. They would establish a convergence point and fire steadily into it. The tactic spread rapidly, not because orders demanded it, but because results validated it. Crews who had once endured devastating losses now returned with far fewer casualties. Luftwaffe squadrons, accustomed to the dominance of head-on approaches, found themselves confronted with a defensive technique they could neither counter nor anticipate. As winter deepened, the skies over Europe began to shift. The heavy bomber groups, once at the edge of collapse, regained their momentum. Formation integrity improved, morale lifted. Commanders credited enhanced defensive coordination and procedural refinement, phrases that masked the true origin of the change. Official documents rarely mentioned the sergeant by name. In after-action summaries, the tactic appeared as though it had emerged naturally from doctrinal evolution, rather than from one enlisted man's insight. Such omissions were common in wartime. Innovations often became institutional property, detached from the individuals who conceived them. The sergeant observed these developments from the periphery. He continued training gunners until early 1944, passing the method to hundreds of crews rotating through the airfields of East Anglia. Some recognized him and thanked him directly. Others learned the technique without ever knowing who had first imagined it. He accepted both reactions with the same quiet demeanor. His purpose had never been recognition. It had been survival for himself, for his friends, for every young airman who climbed into a bomber wondering whether he would return. When his orders arrived directing him back to the United States to assist with stateside gunnery schools, he packed his few belongings without ceremony. A handful of officers shook his hand. A few gunners approached him on the tarmac, offering a final nod of gratitude. No medal accompanied his departure. No commendation recorded his contribution. Official reports credited revised engagement. Doctrine. The sergeant boarded a transport plane and left Europe behind, his part in the air war largely invisible to the institution he had helped save. After the war, he returned to Kansas. He took work where he could find it, eventually settling back into the rhythm of rural life. Neighbors knew him as a reliable man, quiet, good with tools, patient with animals. He seldom spoke of his wartime experiences. His children grew up aware that he had served in the Army Air Forces, but knew little more. He never claimed credit for what had happened over Germany. The tactic that had spared hundreds of bomber crewmen remained hidden behind official terminology and wartime secrecy. Decades passed. The men he had trained grew old, many carrying with them vivid memories of the missions they survived because of the method he had taught. Some spoke of it to their families, others kept it private, as veterans often did. But the impact remained a silent thread woven through the lives of those who returned home when, by all expectation, They should not have. When the sergeant died, in the summer of 1992, his funeral was small. Family, friends, a pastor from the local church. The obituary mentioned his service record without elaboration to most in attendance. He had lived an ordinary life, modest and unadorned, but near the end of the service, as the crowd thinned, 3 elderly men stepped forward, strangers to the family, but unmistakably former airmen, their bearing shaped by years of discipline and memory. They approached the sergeant's children and explained who they were. Gunners who had flown in the winter of 1943 and 1944. Men who had defended their crews using the method he had taught. They described missions where head-on waves broke apart under concentrated fire. They recalled moments when the fixed-point tactic allowed their aircraft to return home intact. One of them, voice unsteady with age, said simply, "Your father changed everything for us. We lived because he taught us how to shoot." Only then did the family begin to understand the full scope of what he had contributed. In the quiet of a rural cemetery, beneath an unremarkable marker bearing his name, the truth emerged not through official citation, but through the testimony of those whose lives he had touched. Wars are shaped by generals, strategy, and production, but sometimes they are saved by an unknown gunner who dared to think differently, who saw the battlefield as it was not as the manuals claimed it to be, and who found a way to bring men home when hope was fading. His legacy was not written in headlines or medals. It lived in the generations that followed, carried forward by those who survived because he had the courage to question what others accepted. If stories like this remind you how ordinary men changed the course of history, subscribe. There are hundreds more forgotten battles, untold heroes, and hidden decisions waiting to be uncovered.